We can start as everyone is coming in. So let me just do this. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to the third episode of Diggin In for season 2. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series. And Diggin In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through June for our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at the peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you enjoy our programming, considering expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, we are able to bring you outstanding programming through the support of viewers like you. So today we are excited to welcome Dr. Ryan Wheeler. Ryan Wheeler is the director of the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass. And he served as the editor of the Florida Anthropologist from 1999 through 2006, and is now the editor of the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and co-editor of the Open Access Journal of Archaeology and Education. And he has also published extensively in state and regional journals. And at the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function on the either at the bottom or at the side of your Zoom screen. And we will then give our speaker time to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding that we might not get to all of them today. So welcome, Dr. Wheeler, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. And thank you to everybody that has joined in today. As I said, kind of jokingly, I hope that I hope there's something. I hope you find something in this discussion and presentation that sort of meets your interests, wherever you might be in terms of archaeological publishing. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I tried to kind of limit the number of slides and things to share, so that we'll have time for your questions. And my hope is it's a pretty informal conversation. And so let's see, do this. Can everybody, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. So as I said, I'm gonna be sharing some tips, tricks, and insights on kind of writing writing and publishing your first article. Though some of you may have already published, and hopefully there'll be some tips and tricks and things like that in here that you will find interesting. And as Lindsay said, I've had a lot of experience writing and publishing articles, but also as an editor. So the things I'm sharing are things that I kind of like to see when articles come in, but also things that I've learned through those, well, since 1992. I've actually got an image in these slides of my first archaeological article that was published. I want to take a moment and offer a land acknowledgement. The language here was developed by Indigenous students at Phillips Academy, which is our parent institution. And I'll go ahead and read this, but this is kind of a proposal that students and a group of faculty have made to the school. And it hasn't been accepted yet, but this is one of the alternate versions that the students have developed and proposed for Phillips Academy. Phillips Academy occupies the stolen land of the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples and the lands of the contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. We honor all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. We acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities. We understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. Phillips Academy is a settler institution, and as members of the Andover community, we perpetuate settler colonialism. We commit to interrogating the histories of and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy and beyond. So, some thoughts on getting started as you begin your publishing, your archaeological publishing careers. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about selecting what it is you're writing about. That's presumably something that would come from your interests. The first article that I ever published in an archaeological society journal was on my analysis of a collection that had been made by an avocational archaeological society. They had excavated a site that was being impacted by construction, but the members hadn't got around to doing the analysis or the writing. And so as an undergraduate in Florida, I took that on and worked with the collection and the field notes and basically wrote a site report. So one of the first steps is to find a journal that you're going to publish in. That's gotten a little bit easier because a lot of journals have an online presence today. Some of them actually publish things online and some publish only online. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm involved in editing the Journal of Archaeology and Education, which doesn't have a print aspect. It's completely online. Other journals are online and in print, and some are just still in print only. And so, ways to find the right journal. Look at the things that you're citing while you're researching your article. Is there a particular journal that keeps coming up as you generate your bibliography, your references? The next thing that you should probably think about doing is reviewing their style guide. So most journals have a style guide. It's often on their website. In some cases, it's been published in one of their issues. Sometimes you might have to ask the editor for a copy. In other cases, they offer it online. And this sort of gives you lots of details about how to format your article. Back in the olden days, people actually wanted you to submit paper copies that were then sent out for review. Typically today, it's all handled electronically, but it can really help streamline the process if you make sure that your formatting and your submission to match the journal style guide. Because if you don't, chances are the editor is going to send it back to you and tell you to take a look at the style guide. So if you do that first, things will go a little bit more smoothly. And one of my big tips really is to pick a couple example articles. So find some articles from the journal that you're going to submit to and use those as a template really for the article that you're writing. So not necessarily sort of wholesale borrowing their outline or anything like that, but having a couple of good examples that you have close at hand, maybe printed out next to your computer while you're writing, can be really helpful. How did that article handle different headings and sections? how did they handle references that might be a little unusual? And so that's a great idea. Have those handy while you're working. So this is kind of your article at 30,000 feet. Start off with a statement about why your topic, what you're writing about, is important. You won't believe how many articles actually get published where the author never tells us why what they're writing about is important. They sort of assume that we know the answer to that question. But the reality is that you should articulate that really clearly at the beginning of your article, and then you should loop back to that at the end to make it clear to readers and to the editors and the reviewers why what you're writing about is important. And so it could be adding to a story that is poorly known. It could be creating a catalog of a particular type of object or artifact. But make it clear to the reader why it's important. And I have to confess that my spouse, who's a historian, is the one that pointed it out to me, that when she was reading through some of my archaeological literature, certainly nothing I wrote, but some of the things from my bookshelf, she was like, these things just sort of, people just kind of launch into these articles, and they don't really say why these things are important. So anyway, keep that in mind. One of the other pieces of advice that I find that I'm frequently giving to those who are submitting articles to the journals that I've edited is craft your article like it's a story. Make sure that there's a narrative element to it. So when you're writing, think about storytelling. So if you're sharing with somebody, a friend or a colleague, the story of your research, you're talking to them. How do you construct that story? So your article, it's not a fictional story. It's a factual story. But it needs to have a narrative element, and that will make it much more accessible and much more readable. And if you don't do that, you may get lots of comments and notes back from the editor and reviewers. And one other thing at this sort of high level is start with a good outline. Really invest in the kind of skeleton of the story that you're relating. And at a very basic level, that could be something like an introduction, the methods, theoretical approach that you're using, results, some discussion, and then a conclusion and references. But the more detail that you put into constructing that outline to start with, the easier it will be to fill in all of those sections as you go. And I've seen people really kind of go sideways with things that they're working on, especially if it's longer, something that they've been working on for a really long time. As they find new pieces of information, they get excited and they add them in, but they don't really think about how they fit into that outline, or they might not have had a very good outline to start with, or maybe they didn't have an outline at all. And so when you read the draft at the end, the final draft, it's pretty clunky because it looks like it's, kind of just all these things that are interesting kind of stuck together. And your article has to be more than a bunch of interesting things stuck together. It's got to have a narrative quality to it. But it's also, it's got to have a structure. And I think the other thing that's nice that's changed about archaeological writing, certainly over the last couple of years, maybe the last decade or so, is that you can inject yourself into it. So archaeological writing in the mid 20th century was very matter of fact. Writing now has gotten a little less formal. And so there's an opportunity for you to say things like, I was collecting this information on these particular types of artifacts for this catalog, and I found this source, and it really changed the way that I thought about it. And I'm going to tell you why that is the case in this, particular section. All right, I've already hit this, why it's, you can't really emphasize, I can't emphasize this part enough. Next time you pick up some sort of archaeological literature, a book or a magazine, look to see if it's really clear why the author thinks what they're telling you is important. If they do, that's probably a good example to hang on to. This is something I was just talking about, is taking those outlines, a really good outline, and then converting it into headers. And so there are different theories about headers. Some people don't like headers very much. They think that they're a little bit of a kind of a cheat that people use, where if they're not particularly good writers and good at crafting the transitions from one section to another. I think they can be very useful. So if you craft a really detailed outline, those outline elements can convert to being your primary, secondary, and tertiary headers. And so, as I promised you a few minutes ago, I was going to share this first page of my first archaeological publication from 1992. I was on this Archaeological Society's collection, and you can see all of these headers here. I've got an introduction, materials and methods, results, and then under results there are some secondary headings. And so that can be a really handy way to organize your thinking. So some things about working with editors. Oftentimes, it's not a bad idea to touch base with an editor before you actually send your submission in. You could tell them that you're thinking about publishing in their journal, and send them a quick message and ask if there's any guidance that they might have. Also, it's a good idea to check and make sure that the journal is staying up to date. So I've noticed a couple of journals regionally here in the Northeast that have long histories, but they haven't published anything for a few years. So you want to send your piece to an active journal that's got issues coming out every year. And it's a fair question to ask an editor before you submit, what the timeline looks like. Are you looking at your article coming out in a year, 5 years? If you're submitting to, sort of some of these top tier journals like American Antiquity, it could take a really long time for your piece to come out, which is sort of one of the beauties of the open access online journals, is they take that you have their recent set of instructions for authors. This next one is really something that I can't emphasize enough. So it's not your job as the author to do any formatting, really. So editors are happy when they get documents that don't have a lot of excessive formatting. So if you've gone to great pains to try to make your manuscript, your typescript, computer script, I'm not sure what the right expression is anymore, look like one of the articles in the journal, you don't really want to do that. The editor will either do that layout work, or they have somebody who's a technical editor who does all of the layout. So you don't have to do any of that. You just have to have the headings, the text, the references with very, very, very minimal formatting. So do not use your computer software to introduce a lot of formatting. That can actually make a lot more work for the editor having to strip that out. And if it's really excessive, they may have to use a computer program to strip it all out. And that's an opportunity where things can kind of get potentially sort of lost or goofed up. And also be prepared for revisions. I'm not sure I've ever talked to anybody who submitted an article to a journal that was just straight up accepted and then published. Usually what happens is the editor will send your piece out to reviewers, somebody who's knowledgeable on the topic that you're writing about, and they'll make some recommendations about whether the piece should be published with minor revisions, with major revisions. They may just send it back to you and say, we can't accept it like this, but here are recommendations about areas that need attention. And the advice that I always give to authors is that you don't necessarily have to do exactly what the reviewers or the editor are telling you, but if they're pointing to a particular section of your manuscript, it means something has to happen there. What you have written isn't clear at the very least and needs some attention. And so when you send your revised manuscript back to the editor, usually they're pointing out things like typos and spelling things. Maybe there's some reorganization that needs to happen. Maybe there are things missing from your references. That's really easy. That happens. But if you decided to keep something that the editor had asked you to change or address, you will need to defend that decision on your part. And also, most editors aren't paid, they're volunteers. And so be patient with them because, they're balancing families and work and their editing duties. Illustrations. So this is a place where people often get tripped up, even people that have done a lot of publishing. And actually the transition to digital photography, I think, generally sort of reduced the quality of images in publications, because people often don't understand the sort of kind of technical part of photographs. They have a digital photo, maybe that they took with their cell phone. Of course, those are pretty big now, so that's good. But even just a few years ago, those could be kind of tiny. They look good on the screen. So if you look at this, if you look at this image, this is kind of a comparison showing a low resolution image on the right and a higher resolution version of the same image on the left. The thing to keep in mind is that you want your images to be at least 300 DPI, dots per inch, or above. You want them to be really big files. And so, this is something that's really challenging. You also want them, not to be made up of layers of different images. You don't want to create them in word processing programs. you want to make them in things like Adobe Photoshop or in a program like Adobe Illustrator. And so illustrations are really important to an article. It adds a lot of visual interest and appeal. Picture tells 1,000 words, but at the same time, if they're not good resolution, the editor will send them back to you, and they won't be you won't be able to use them. So make sure that you get images that are high quality. And if it's an image that's coming from a book or another source, you didn't create it, chances are you may need to get permission for that using that photo, if it's not sort of public domain. I wasn't sure if I should put this at the beginning or at the end of this talk, but I decided to put it here. This is something that is becoming, well, I think it's been important, but it's often been ignored, especially when we're writing about Native Americans, or we're writing about another culture, whatever culture that might be. Have we been in touch with the descendant community that we're essentially writing about? So if you're writing an article about a Native American site or indigenous material culture, which archaeologists tend to call artifacts, it's a good idea to be in touch with the descendant communities, the tribes, tribal nations, whose ancestors lived at those places or made those objects, and to do that early on in your research, not when your article is been accepted or just getting ready to be printed, or you finished it. So it's a good idea to talk not just to a community member, but to the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And there's actually an organization of tribal historic preservation officers. And so you can go online and find that and look up the communities that you're potentially should be in touch with, and talk to them about the research that you're doing. Is it appropriate? Are there things that might give the community some concern? And so those kinds of relationships are really important. There are also a number of books that have come out fairly recently on writing about how to write about indigenous cultures. This is a great one that I got and read fairly recently, Elements of Indigenous Style. So, don't stop there though. Reach out to the descendant community and have some conversations with them about your work. And that can really, those relationships can be really fruitful. They can also help avoid, further kind of harm to that community. So this is just kind of a recap. I'll start with that one. Make sure you've involved descendant communities in your work. Try to find the right journal for your piece. Keep an eye on the length. Look at the length of the other articles that are in the journal that you're thinking of submitting to. If your article is twice as long as any of those articles, chances are maybe you've got 2 articles there, and you might need to think about splitting it or concision. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to consult the journal style guide. That will really help. Make sure that you're preparing high resolution figures. Be prepared for revisions, and don't be discouraged. So all of us who've done a fair amount of publishing have sent articles off only to have them rejected by the journal that we thought was the perfect place to publish. So don't worry too much about that. You know, if you do get rejected, find another journal, you know, use the notes that you get from the editor and reviewer. Though that cannot ever hurt. All right, so let's see. That is the end of my slides. I can stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have, or if people want to talk about very particular things, or if people have some general comments or questions.
Yes, and everyone, you can send the questions directly to me. We already have one. Ryan, what is your take on the proliferation of pay to publish journals seeking fees for publication?
Well, I wouldn't really bother with that. You know, I think people have demonstrated that those are sort of scamish, if not sort of straight up scams. Now, in some cases, some journals require that you be a member of their sort of parent organization. So I remember in Florida, the Florida Scientist is published by the Florida Academy of Sciences, and you have to be a member in order to submit an article and publish there. But that's a little different than the sort of pay to play thing. And I think some people have actually done these computer generated articles that are just kind of gobbledygook, and they've submitted them, paid the fees, and the things have been published. So that sort of says a lot about those journals. Yeah. And I get those solicitations all the time.
Yeah, and then there's also the RXIV, the Archive Preprint Journals. Does that fall under the same thing as?
I'm not sure. You know, at some level, you can start to worry about things like, you know, is the journal indexed? You know, what are the metrics? You know, so you want to, you know, if you get really serious about this and you're going for tenure as a professor, then that, you know, where you publish becomes really important. You know, I've tried to match my writing and where I'm publishing it to where I think it will have the biggest impact in terms of getting information to an audience. But unfortunately, sort of the politics of academia have kind of taken things a little sideways with that. I mean, in terms of the, some journals will publish your piece online before it comes out in print. And so that's kind of nice. The information gets out there a little sooner, and you don't have to wait for the issue to come out. Okay. I mean, the other thing is, you know, there are journals that are not peer reviewed. So the editor reads the articles, decides, you know, gives you comments and edits. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it is good to submit to journals that do peer review, just because you'll get better comments and it will actually help make your article better. Because no editor is going to be able to sort of know everything and be able to read every article and sort of understand all of the ins and outs of each particular topic. So peer review is good. Not necessary though. If you're going for tenure, probably need that though.
Well, speaking of like tenure, if you were like a new graduate student, either out of a master's program or just finishing up your PhD, what kind of journals would you recommend looking at? Because knowing not everyone on their first thing is going to get into like American antiquity. You know. Right.
Well, yeah. You know, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, not everybody is going to be able to publish in American Antiquity. I mean, the nice thing is that Society for American Archaeology has about, I think they have 3 different journals now. So there's one that's dedicated to practice. There's another one that's Latin American Antiquity and American Antiquity. So there's a little bit more opportunity to publish at something that's kind of at a, national, international level. Um, I mean, certainly if you're, in academia, and your goal is to be a college professor and get tenure, you are gonna wind up having to publish in, those kinds of national journals. Um, you know, Chances are your first article that you write and publish isn't going to be in there unless you're just really some kind of superstar. So, state level journals are a great place to start, especially if you're you know, working with a collection or doing basically a site report. The nice thing too is that, as you get into those national and international sort of first tier journals, um, the articles tend to be a lot shorter. So if you've got a longer article, you can sort of probably claim more pages in a state or regional journal.
Okay.
So there's plenty of great state and regional journals, specialty journals that you can find to, for a first article for sure.
Okay. We do have a comment from Dan Sandweiss that there are some paid published journals that are serious, like Science Advances, Scientific Report from Nature, but that he thinks it's Beale's list, which is the standard for listing the predatory journals. Um,
Hmm.
so people should definitely check that out. And it's sort of changing because of NSF and other funding agency requirements and things like that. Another question is, as an editor or someone who, talks with other editors, what is like the most common mistake that you see, like sort of new people doing when they send it off to publishers? What's like the number one mistake?
Um, Well, I tried to hit some of those things that show up a lot. One, I'd say there's kind of a trio. One is that people don't tell you why their thing is important. Two is that they don't follow your style guide. Um, Three is that their figures are just a mess. Um, Usually the resolution on the photos is bad, or they're not very contrasty, and so they sort of don't look like much. I mean, that's the nice thing about an online publication, actually, sort of thinking about it, is usually they can have color photos. In print, that's pretty rare just because that's expensive. And so I would say those are kind of the big 3.
Okay. Our last question, I think, right now is if you have an idea, like you've done something at a conference with like a group of people on one topic, how would you approach a editor that maybe have a specific topic with multiple people writing about? How would you approach an editor about something like that?
Oh, like a conference proceedings?
Yeah, but like, like have your, first, if you do 2 journals a year, first one maybe is all about our one topic and there's 5 of us writing.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a great idea, and actually is something that, an editor could potentially get really excited about if you were kind of bringing a bunch of articles together, perhaps like a conference, proceedings. So oftentimes, the first step, which I didn't actually mention, but now that I think about it, as you give your paper at a conference, and then you wind up turning that into an article, and so that's pretty common. So you present first, and you may get some good feedback from the conference, and then you sort of turn it into um, an article submission. Yeah, I mean, I think, editors can be very excited about the prospect of, a bunch of people coming with a theme issue. My experience has been that people really like theme issues, where you're putting together, you know, a bunch of information on a given site, or types of objects, or whatever the case may be, because then that issue becomes kind of like the go-to publication. And so readers tend to really like those thematic issues.
Got it. Well, those were the questions we had for you, Ryan. So thank you.
Fantastic.
And thank you to all our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which will be on Wednesday, March 10th, when we are joined by Dr. Lindsay Montgomery, who will be speaking about Comanche imperialism and the myth of Western conquest. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. So thank you, Dr. Wheeler, again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully we'll
Thank
see you in
you.
2 weeks. Bye.